Hi, I'm Steve Clemons, and I have a question. Are China and the United States headed for a new Cold War? Or is it going to be a hot war? Let's get to the bottom line. The downward spiral began years ago, but in the last few days it has really sunk to new lows. Following a pattern of knee-jerk tit-for-tatism, Washington just shut down China's consulate in Texas last week. And in response, Beijing shut down America's consulate in Chengdu. Thousands of Chinese watched as the U.S. flag was lowered from that former diplomatic post. As part of America's full court press, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo gave a speech asking the world to embark with it on a new Cold War with China. The two countries already have a trade war, they've got new travel restrictions on each other, and they've been banning each other's journalists, among other escalations. So where do we go from here? From a strategic perspective, what are the right, smart moves that America should be making? Joining me now is the president of the Council on Foreign Relations, Richard Haass, who has served many U.S. presidents in the past and is a prolific writer on global issues and U.S. foreign policy. He's just finished a new book designed to help bolster the literacy of Americans about the world beyond their shores, appropriately titled The World. Good to be with you, Richard. Richard, you recently wrote a critique of Secretary Mike Pompeo's speech at the Nixon Library, and in it you said he misunderstood history. He misunderstood what Nixon and Kissinger were trying to do with China at that time. Tell us more.
Good to be with you, Steve. The Secretary of State suggested that the engagement policy with China had failed because it didn't bring about a China that was more open and liberal politically or economically. And what I argued is that was never the intention. That was never the goal. The policy aimed to change Chinese foreign policy to work with China against the common enemy of the Soviet Union. And in fact, it succeeded. We won the Cold War on terms that even an optimist would have had difficulty coming up with.
But isn't it partially true that in later steps, like bringing China into the World Trade Organization, bringing it into various international institutions, the thought was that those institutions would liberalize it?
I think there was some who had what I thought was an overly optimistic view of what to expect once we brought China into those institutions. I also think that we made certain mistakes that after China was brought into the WTO, I don't think we adjusted the terms of their membership as China's economy began to grow, as China became more integrated in the world. We kept treating them as a quote unquote developing country when we ought to have been more demanding. But again, I still thought the basic thrust of the policy, which is more traditional, was to influence Chinese foreign policy. And the whole idea was to embed them in arrangements in the region so that, among other things, they wouldn't be tempted to use military force to change the status of Taiwan or to change the situation in the South China Sea. And my argument is that for 4 decades, that policy largely worked.
Well, right now, it seems that Donald Trump is very fixated on China. Now, we are a few months just before an election in the United States. And I remember when Barack Obama and Mitt Romney were running against each other, they talked every other day about China being a currency manipulator and the complications and problems China was creating in the world. Is this a lot of election posturing, or do you think there's something deeper and more real in President Trump's posturing on China?
Yeah, the short answer to your question is yes, it's both. I do think to some extent it's election posturing. There has been an attempt to, in some ways, blame China for recent problems, including the pandemic. And China ought to be criticized harshly for its behavior early on. Though I think once the pandemic reached our shores, the responsibility is our own, both for what we've done and, more important, for what we haven't done. But taking a step back, I think it would be wrong to dismiss many of the problems in U.S.-Chinese relations simply as they're a byproduct of the American political calendar, and that after November they're going away. I don't think so. I think the problems are real, and they're going to be challenging either for President Biden or for President Trump. Indeed, this might seem counterintuitive to some people watching this. It might be slightly more difficult for President Biden in the sense that he's unlikely to be as preoccupied as President Trump with these narrow trade deals about expanding American exports to China. So I don't think the United States under President Biden, again, I don't mean to speak for him, obviously, but if it were to happen, I don't think China is simply agreeing to higher levels of agricultural or manufacturing would make a big difference.
Well, I want to get to Hong Kong, as you just mentioned for a moment, but you said something that really stands out to me. You don't see, even if there's a change in leadership in the United States, an easy snapback going back to a different kind of U.S.-China relationship.
No, I think this is now, and it's embedded structurally in the bilateral relationship. But also, if you read the sorts of things that people advising Vice President Biden have been writing in, say, magazines like ours in Foreign Affairs, it's not as though this represents a soft on China perspective. To the contrary, a lot of the people who seem to have Vice President Biden's ear have been consistently tough on China over human rights concerns, the Uyghurs, and the more broad repression in the country. As I tell people in China, you shouldn't just attribute this to either President Trump or to the American election. This is out there. It's real. There's a degree of bipartisanship here. Where I think, though, there could be a big difference is, though, in a President Biden's, if it comes to that, his willingness to forge a common relationship with American allies in Europe and in Asia. And actually, I think that has a bit of an upside promise to put more pressure on China.
You mentioned Hong Kong a minute ago. Let me play you a clip of something President Trump said on Hong Kong.
But that's between Hong Kong and that's between China, because Hong Kong is a part of China. They'll have to deal with that themselves. They don't need advice.
Now let's listen to Secretary Pompeo on Hong Kong.
Indeed, we have a NATO ally of ours that hasn't stood up in the way that it needs to with respect to Hong Kong because they fear Beijing will restrict access to China's market. This is the kind of timidity that will lead to historic failure, and we can't repeat it. We cannot repeat the mistakes of these past years.
So we have two leading members of this administration, one the president and the other the Secretary of State, saying diametrically opposed views on Hong Kong. So I want to get back to your point about what are we to make of these mixed signals when it comes to China, when it comes to allies. You know, are they with us? Are they against us? Those kinds of issues.
We'll separate it into two areas. One is the very mixed signals about U.S. indifference to what China did either in Hong Kong or against the Uyghurs. John Bolton's book, as you know, basically has the president giving the Chinese a free ride to do pretty much what they want to their own citizens, even gross violations of human rights. It's one of the reasons that some of this criticism now by the Secretary of State seems like too little, too late, and the fact that it's just aimed at China. I don't see equivalent criticism of Russia or Turkey or other countries which, shall we say, merit criticism on these grounds. Again, it makes it look quite opportunistic rather than principled. And again, in the Secretary of State's speech, the way he discussed Germany, this kind of back of the hand to them, that's not, in my experience, the way to bring about alliance cooperation, be it against China or anybody else. And this administration, and what was its first big foreign policy decision when it came into office? It was not to join the Trans-Pacific Partnership. That would have put us together with countries representing at least another 20-25% of global GDP. We then together could have gone to China and say, hey, you want access to our markets? Here's the economic standards you're going to have to meet in terms of trade, in terms of respecting intellectual property, what have you. So it's very hard for the administration now to be saying we're robust on China, when in all sorts of ways it kicked away opportunities over the years to do and be just that.
You know, one of the other points that you raise in your critique is that America seems to be putting up barriers, complaining, but not necessarily moving into fixing problems. As you've just said, not necessarily finding allies to find common purpose with, whether it's climate change or Huawei. You've worked with everyone in foreign policy, and do they not see this?
Look, I remember when I met with then candidate Trump during the campaign, and we talked about the world and about American foreign policy. And one of the things I came away with is that he really has a negative view towards allies. Rather than seeing them as partners, rather than seeing them as force multipliers, rather than seeing them as a structural advantage for the United States, he tends to see them as free riders. He tends to see them as economic competitors. And what I really think this administration needs is a different view. I don't know, they'll put a fundamental change in their take on what partners and allies are, and that we have to be willing to do things with them rather than to them. And we just can't insist they work with us against China or anybody else. Rather, we've got to consult with them and come up with a common front. And it may mean in certain cases we put aside some of our economic differences because we have this greater priority of coming up with a common front on China. That's what strategy is all about. You establish priorities, you act in a disciplined way, and I simply don't see us doing that here.
Now, you're not only someone focused on guns and militaries and, the classic, you also spend, particularly in your new book, which I'd love to get into, you talk about, economics and the global financial order. And to a certain degree, most of the people that I know that have focused on U.S.-China relations, just like we used to talk about Japan, say there are economic interdependencies that are really profound between these two countries and that you just can't untangle them without staggering costs. And so what is your take on the economic dimensions? And do you see things like the reserve currency status of the dollar threatened in a collision like I think somewhat in this town in Washington with China today?
You raise a couple of big issues. I think the idea that the United States and China could quote unquote decouple, totally divorce, I think is simply not on. China's too present in too many places. The U.S.-Chinese economic relationship is too elaborate and too extensive. The real question is, could and should we in certain select areas distance ourselves, particularly areas, say, of high technology? And I think the answer there is maybe. But again, to use a famous strategic saying, you can't beat something with nothing. So if you want to encourage others not to opt into a Chinese-led 5G system, you need to then have an American or American-European or American-European-Japanese, South Korean alternative. And right now, at least, there isn't one. But it seems to me the goal is not a total divorce. On the other hand, it's not a total marriage with China. What I think is we need something a little bit more in the gray area, and I think that's possible. You raise a second issue, though, which is the role of the dollar. And that depends on lots of things, but it depends on American competence and perceptions of it. It depends upon the fact that America won't approach its handling of the dollar just narrowly, but will think about its implications for the rest of the world. And I think the combination of COVID, how our incompetent response to that, at times our weaponizing the dollar through various sanctions, running up this enormous debt. I think all this and more has raised questions about the dollar. So I don't think this is the sort of thing that ends in a day. But I do think gradually you'll begin to see, probably on an accelerated time frame, the emergence of various, not so much alternatives, but they would coexist with the dollar. One question is whether China makes its currency much more convertible. There's the question of the euro, question of the yen, question of cryptocurrencies. But I think the era where the dollar was pretty much the only game in town, I think we're probably at the beginning of the end of that era. And with that, the United States could lose a lot of influence and could find itself more economically vulnerable to the implications or consequences of its own economic policy and weaknesses in some area.
I mean, as a planner who's helped guide U.S. foreign policy through so many hinge points after the fall of the Berlin Wall, after many other times, this must be a time that's frustrating for you when you see a kind of diminishment of American power in the world.
Well, I do, and I worry about it. I don't think it's warranted, and I don't see a substitute coming about. It'd be one thing if the United States was dialing down and there was something better we and others were putting in its place, but I don't see that. I think the alternative to a world that is led by the United States working with probably a world that's much less organized. I think it would be to the detriment of the United States and everybody else. And what's so frustrating to me, Steve, as I expect it might be to you, is I don't think there's cost savings in this. The whole mindset that American leadership costs us more than it benefits us is just simply wrong. It's not borne out by the facts or by history. And as we learned on 9/11, as we're learning now with COVID-19, we can't insulate ourselves from the world. So even if we there's an argument we should be doing more here at home, I get it. We're going to have to deal with the tens of millions of unemployed and our health problems and our race problems. But the world's not going to say, okay, you Americans, go sort out your domestic problems and come back when you're ready. We'll just, we'll park and we'll wait for you. History doesn't work that way. There's no pause button. We have got to pay attention to the world at the same time we pay attention to our domestic problems, or the world will deteriorate. And that will actually make it even tougher for us to deal with our domestic challenges. So I worry about the dynamics. Some of this began under the previous administration, particularly we saw signs of it in the Middle East, but we're seeing it really accelerate now. The word I constantly use is abdication. We've really pulled back in a dramatic way. And I worry because when I look at the sweep of history and I look at the last 70, 75 years, the post-World War II era, I think this has been an extraordinary run, not just for the United States, but for the world. No great power conflict, incredible increases in wealth and standards of living, billions of people brought out of poverty. The average lifespan around the world has increased by in some cases, decades. Democracy has flourished in many places around the world. So for me, to do anything that hastens the end of this order, which the United States had so much to do with bringing about and sustaining, I really think short-sighted would be an understatement.
The book you've just written, The World, is very interesting, and I'm one of the many thousands of people who've read all of your books. I really appreciate your willingness to share with us your insights about global affairs and the tectonics of this system that we're in. But I guess when I watched Donald Trump beat Hillary Clinton, when I would go to Oklahoma and Kansas, Texas, talk to my relatives, they had this sense, it was a joke in New York and DC, but they had this sense that America had fought the Cold War and China had won, that the benefits to them of being internationally engaged were more problems and costs than they were benefits. And you began to see people, particularly military families who had generations of military service, begin to kind of reject global affairs. You've now written this book called The World to try to bolster the literacy of those folks and to tell them. But tell us about the book and why you did it.
Well, the reason I did it is I thought that too many Americans didn't understand why the world matters, didn't understand the costs and benefits of American involvement in the world. You can graduate from virtually any of our great universities and not learn any of these subjects. They're offered, but they're not required for students to take before they graduate. We really don't cover these issues in any depth on our news programs, nightly news program on television. The internet does have this information. The problem is it has tons of other information, and the internet doesn't come with little notes saying read this, but not that. And what worried me is that because Americans didn't understand, in many cases, the importance of the world and the costs and benefits of American involvement in the world, that we'd be too willing to simply walk away from it. We're seeing signs of that. And what I think is the benefits have and continue to largely dwarf the costs in terms of American involvement, which is not to say we haven't made mistakes. And I think we overreached in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. And that fed this narrative that the world is simply an expensive, dangerous place that's not worth it. But the real danger now is not American overreach. It's American underreach. And what I want to do is write a book that basically makes 2 points. The world matters. Isolationism is folly. And second of all, that there's nothing we can do better in the world by ourselves than we can do with others. There is a case for multilateralism. Obviously, it has to be smart. We've got to be creative. But my argument is to make Americans more aware about the world, in part so when they go vote, say this November, they look at what the candidates are saying, because whoever they do make president or whoever they make a senator or a congressman, these people are going to have tremendous influence over what the United States does in the world, which in turn will affect the world, which will have then tremendous impact on the lives of Americans. So my goal was essentially to write a book that made these connections clear.
Well, I think we're all grateful for that. When you look at Libya today and you see Russia now operating in Libya, which would have been unthinkable a few years ago. I'm interested in what you think is going to unfold in that region or other regions of the world. Are we just going towards chaos, or do you see something else out there?
Look, I wish I could give you an optimistic answer, but the Middle East has been is and quite likely will be the most turbulent part of the world right now. Things could get worse given the situation with Iran, given the challenges in Egypt and in Saudi Arabia. So I don't see any of the prerequisites, Steve, in the Middle East of stability or progress by virtually every measure. We haven't decided is what's, if you will, the Goldilocks solution. What's neither too much nor too little. And I think that's a debate that we're quietly having in this country. We're having a little bit about Afghanistan, about Syria, about American forces in Iraq. And what could drive this in many ways is also what does Iran do? And what does the United States describe or just basically come to conclude is tolerable or is not? So, there might be a lot of Americans who want to be done with the Middle East, but the Middle East is not done with the United States. So I think we're going to be involved here deeply for years to come. But a lot of the details have yet to be determined by the United States.
Richard, I would be remiss if I didn't ask you one more question, again, related to a different book you once wrote. In that book, you basically argued that U.S. foreign policy was directly linked to the domestic economic and social conditions of a country. It's hard to imagine a bigger mess than in the United States today, with 44 million people unemployed, racial divides in the nation, and a pandemic hitting as sort of three tsunamis at the same time. And so I just want to ask you to reflect on the domestic sources of foreign policy, which you got at and said, we got to fix this stuff. But you said it years ago. That was not heeded. And so I just kind of remember that book and say, wow, if only everyone had read Richard Haass. But tell me your thoughts right now on this moment where our domestic set of conditions are pretty horrible.
No, thank you for raising it. The book was Foreign Policy Begins at Home. And you're right, the immediate situation, the pandemic, the tens of millions of unemployed, the racial divide, whoever wins this election is going to inherit all of that. And that will clearly demand a lot of our attention. But I think you're also getting at something deeper, even beyond those three things. We have all sorts of other domestic challenges. We've got the challenge of a public education system that is not educating most Americans nearly well enough. We have an infrastructure that is truly inadequate. We don't spend enough federal money on basic research. Our immigration system makes no sense. We're not attracting and keeping the most talented people in the world who want to come there. So right now, the biggest threat to our competitiveness in many ways is ourselves. And if we're going to, we began this conversation, Steve, talking about China. And the answer to a successful relationship in China, I would argue, is not keeping China down. That's beyond our capability. The Chinese will determine their own trajectory. What we need to do, though, is determine our own trajectory. And we need to make the United States more competitive and deal with all these domestic challenges we've got, because national security, at the end of the day, has both a foreign policy dimension and a domestic dimension. It's a coin with two sides. And we won't be able to have the resources to succeed in the world, to present a successful model to the world, unless we get it right here at home. And unless we get it right here at home, Americans won't have an appetite to be heavily involved in the world. So again, whoever wins this election, you can choose anything when you run for president. The one thing you can't choose is your inbox. And whoever wins is going to inherit a daunting inbox of everything from China to climate change to North Korea to Iran to Venezuela and more around the world. And in America, as you correctly say, challenged by these immediate issues like COVID, like unemployment, like racism, as well as issues like our healthcare problems and our educational problems and our infrastructure problems. This is going to be one of the most critical eras in our history, really, for our entire history.
Well, Richard Haass, president of the Council on Foreign Relations and author of the book that you should all read called The World, thank you so much for joining us. These are defining times for America and the world. As Larry Summers and others have said, this feels like a big hinge point in history, and we're very grateful for your time and insights. Thank you so much.
Great to be with you, Steve.
So what's the bottom line? Don't believe the hype. The tension between the world's two biggest economies is not about ideology. It's all about power. Rising powers will always challenge dominant powers. And unfortunately, America is just shooting itself in the foot and making it easier for China by quitting many of the global institutions that it created and doing little to stay friendly with its friends. So it's no wonder that China looks stronger in the eyes of many when we look to the future. America is still number one in a lot of areas, but it's isolating itself and it's just diminishing and fading on the world stage faster than most Americans know. And that is the bottom line.